Hello and a warm welcome to our IFEAS webinar series. This is part of our IDEA initiative for capacity building in engineering education. We're very excited to have each of you join us today. A warm welcome also to our new IFEAS members who joined us recently at our WEEF conference in Kuala Lumpur. A special thanks to our SPEED students who are also joining us today, and our messages from around the world. My name is Christina White. I'm one of our IFEAS executive members, and it's been a great pleasure to start our IFEAS webinar series. Today we're focusing on a few things cognitive science teaches us about effective teaching. We are indeed excited that this is a global dialogue that's happening around the world. Today we're using our Zoom platform to not just present great information to you about cognitive science and learnings and teaching strategies, but we're going to do it in a manner where we're asking you to interact quite frequently with our presenters. We're going to do this in a few ways. One of them is using the poll feature. So for example, we're interested in what continent do you usually teach in? Go ahead now on your screen and answer either Africa, Asia, Australia or New Zealand, Europe, North America, or South America to give us an idea of where you are in the world. We'll give you a couple moments here to respond to the poll question on your computer or your handheld device. Okay, let's go ahead and see where we're situated in the world. It looks like we've got a fairly good representation here. So as you see, we've got 74% of us attending from Asia and a few in some other continents in the world. This is going to be one of the features that we're using. We're also going to use the chat feature that you'll see here in the Zoom technology towards the bottom of your screen. Richard and Rebecca are going to pose questions and hope that you respond using the chat feature. And also that's a place where you'll have the opportunity if you would like to pose questions back to our presenters. I'd like to now welcome our presenters, Rebecca Brent, who's the president of Education Designs, Inc., and Richard Pelter, who's the Hirsch Celanese Professor Emeritus of Chemical Engineering at North Carolina State University. Again, they're going to present on a few things cognitive science teaches us about effective teaching. This presentation is going to review some of the principal findings of the scientist and outlines practical teaching strategies based on those findings of cognitive scientists. And so we're hoping that you really learn a lot today and also can share some of your experiences. Let's welcome Rebecca and Richard. Thanks so much for joining us.
Great. We're really excited to be with you today. And we want to wish you good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are around the world. We're so happy to be with you today. We're going to start in just a moment with Rich outlining a model of a few things that we know from cognitive science that have some real implications for us as we teach and learn and our students learn. And what we're going to ask you to do after that explanation of the model, it will ask a question. We'll ask you to think about, to speculate, what kinds of implications do you see from that model? What kinds of suggestions would you give a teacher based on that model? And we'll give you a chance to do that. But while he's going through the material at the beginning, we want you to be thinking about the implications for your own teaching. It's important for us that you go away in an hour with some very concrete ideas and things that you can put into place in your own setting to improve the learning of your students.
All right, we're going to do an extremely short course in brain science. We are not cognitive scientists. We are educators, and I also, in a past life, was an engineer. And so this is not going to be a tutorial on cognitive science, but just some of the findings that have been made in cognitive science in the last several decades, and we'll be focusing on the implications of those findings for teaching and learning. So to begin, information is transmitted by the instructor in a class. It also comes from the environment, and it comes into students' sense receptors, their eyes, their ears, and their nose, and their senses of touch, and so forth. And when it comes in, it remains in a register in the brain, and it hangs out there for maybe a second. Most of it is filtered out as not being important, but a controller in the brain identifies information that could be important, and it sends it on to working memory. Now, the working memory contains, and I'm going to stop this now and switch on to something else. Actually, it'll be the same thing, only presented in a somewhat different way for reasons that'll become clear later on in the presentation. So over on the left, you've got an instructor in a class, and you've got the classroom. And information is coming from both the instructor and the environment to the student, who is over there in the middle. Most of the information never gets to the student. There are billions of bits of information assaulting us, our senses at all times, and most of it we are not consciously aware of. Only a small fraction actually gets to our sense receptors. Once it gets to our sense receptors, it goes into that sensory register. It's a receptacle in the brain that holds information for a very brief period of time. A controller in the brain is making that decision. Is this important, or can I just get rid of it? It's trivial, it's not important. And so some of the information, in fact, most of it, gets discarded. It never gets into the individual's consciousness, but the information that is considered important goes into the student's working memory. Working memory is where we do all of our conscious processing. If you're aware of something consciously, like my voice or like the figures on the screen, it's bouncing around in your working memory. The thing of, and what happens in working memory is you have the controller making the same sort of decision. Is this chunk of information that's just come in from the sensory register important? Is this something I might need to know and use someday in the future? Or is it just not important and I can discard it? And it makes those decisions with every chunk of information that comes in. Much of it is discarded, and so it's gone. The student will never be able to access it again because it never got into long-term memory. If the information is considered important by the controller, it stores it in long-term memory. And now, for the first time, you can say that that information has been learned. Once it's in long-term memory, it's going to stay there. Long-term memory has an essentially infinite capacity. And then when a subsequent need for the information arises, the brain can retrieve it and send it back to working memory to do something with it. The thing about retrieval, though, it's not automatic. Once we've learned something for the first time, we may have trouble recalling it when we need it. But the way working memory and long-term memory function, every time we retrieve that piece of information from long-term memory, the connections in the brain that hold it get stronger, and subsequent retrieval becomes easier. This is called spaced retrieval practice. The more you retrieve a piece of information, the easier it is to retrieve it in the future when you need it, like in your job or in your personal life or on the exam in the course that you're taking. The thing about working memory is it has a very low information processing capacity. It can only hold, roughly speaking, 4 chunks of information at any one time, and they're in there for less than a minute before they're either discarded or stored. And that will prove to be very important when we talk about what does this mean for teaching and learning. The one remaining question is, what does the controller in working memory, what criteria does it use to decide this is important or no, I can discard it? And the criteria that it uses are these. First, emotional association. If the information has an emotional association for the student, a positive or a negative one, it evokes fear or anger or pleasure or whatever, the chances that it will be stored are much greater than if it lacks those associations. Second, is the information relevant to information that's already in the student's long-term memory, the student's interests, goals, and things that they've learned previously? The greater the relevance, the more likely the information is to be stored. And finally, comprehensibility. Even if information has relevance to the student, if the student can't understand it at all, it's just being presented in a very unclear manner, the chances are good that it will not be stored.
We have a question right now this might be a good time to address this one. A student retains memory of a movie seen long time ago. Even in childhood, it can be remembered in detail, but the same student can't remember the contents of the lecture last semester. Why is that so?
That's an excellent question, and it has to do with what kind of associations the movie has for the student. All of us, at least in the United States, remember watching the movie Bambi, which is about this little deer. And part of the movie is that the little deer's mother gets shot. We all saw that at age 4 or 5 or 6. We remember it. It had a tremendous emotional association for us, and so we can remember it years later. If the information that you're presenting about stress tensors in the fluid dynamics course, or whatever it may be, has no emotional association and it's irrelevant to anything the student learned before, the chances are it won't be stored in long-term memory, and that means it will never be remembered again.
Okay, so now we're going to turn it over to you, and we have a lot of participants, so we're not sure exactly how well this will work. We'll give it our best shot. We want you to think about that learning model that Rich just gave you, and take a few moments in the chat box to put a few suggestions one or two suggestions you might give teachers to help them improve their students' learning. You can use that chat window, and I'll show the model again in a moment. One thing I do want to tell you too is if you are viewing this webinar with some colleagues, you may prefer to discuss among yourselves this question. Either way is just fine. So while you're writing some responses, let me show you the model again, and you can think about what you'd like to say. We had one person who said, don't launch into a new subject without making connections between it and what the students already know. Great implication.
Another one says, revisit the same content in several classes. Don't make lessons separate. If there are connections between what you're teaching in one class and what you're teaching in another, make them explicit. And that will facilitate spaced retrieval practice, and it'll enhance the sense of relevance of the students, much more likely to be stored.
One person said emotion in engineering is hard, but clarity and relevance are reasonable tools we can use to help students store information. That's great.
Excellent.
Good point. You've got a lot of really good comments, and this is a good time while some of you are still typing in for us to tell you a couple of things. One is that there will be a recording of this webinar, and you'll get information about that. A couple of people have asked that question, and there will be a recording, and you'll get information about how to access that. There's also a handout that will be available to you after the webinar. So lots of material that we're going to talk about, and then additional things will be available to you at that time. And we're delighted to see all the comments. Another thing we'll be doing is compiling those and making sure that you can see all the comments that people have put in, all the suggestions that people have made.
There are over 100 of you at this point who have registered, and people keep checking in. And so there's no possible way we can go through all of the comments here in live. There will be no time for anything else if we do that, but we will compile them, as Rebecca said, and make them available to you after the webinar.
One final comment, someone said, this is so on point. I just read the book, Disruptive Thinking, How We Read, Why How We Read Matters, which focuses on helping students think about the connections between what they're learning and their own lives.
That is an excellent book. That's a good comment. Okay, we're going to move on now.
I want to talk with you just a moment about a couple of implications, and Rich and I will share some ideas here about this business of working memory and getting things into long-term memory. If we think about what a traditional, very typical classroom environment may be in lots of our departments and lots of our universities, there's a lot of lecturing going on. And when we're lecturing, students are just passively receiving that information. And so maybe 4 or 5 chunks are in their working memory, but they don't really have time to do much with it before we present something else new to them. And so they're constantly getting new information, and things are going out of their working memory and not really being stored in long-term memory. So lecturing just by itself doesn't do a very good job of facilitating learning in our classrooms. But what does work is to think about lecturing and activities interspersed. We're going to present material because that we know things and we want to model things for our students, but we want to intersperse opportunities for students to interact, to talk about what we've done, to maybe solve a problem or one step in a problem, to look at what implications something might have before they get the next piece of information. And that's much more likely to lead to them learning.
Just to reinforce one of the main points of this webinar, if what an instructor does is lecture, just 50 minutes of presenting information or 75 minutes or whatever it is, and that's the only thing that happens, you're presenting information to the students far greater than the capacity of working memory to process information. And so you can be absolutely guaranteed that most of the information presented in the lecture will never make it into long-term memory, which means it might as well not have been presented in the first place.
So we know many of you are using some of these techniques in at least some of your classes. And so our next question is a poll, and I'm going to launch that. And it's how often do you include activities in your class sessions? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or in almost every class session. So take a moment now, if you would, and respond. We see many of you are already beginning your responses. That's great. And it's looking like quite a few of you are using active learning strategies, at least sometimes in your classes. We'll give you just another moment or two so that everyone who wants to respond can do so. Someone wrote in their chat box that they have been using the flipped classroom, which is almost an extreme active learning technique where you present a lot of content outside of the class through online resources, and then in class you've got students actively engaged throughout most of the class period. Let me show the poll now, and you can see, let's see, I think, there you go. You can see that most of you have at least tried active learning a little bit. A few of you just rarely. The largest number of responses with sometimes, and then there are quite a few of you who often use it or use it in almost every class. Now, one of the things that is important to know is that this webinar is not about how you use active learning, but we've got in our handout of resources after this webinar, you will see a lot of places where you can learn more about it.
Now, one thing I'll point out, you can't look at that poll and conclude that almost 100% of engineering faculty are using active learning a lot in their classes, because we are a rather select audience here. You are people who have chosen to devote an hour of your time to learning about teaching and learning. Many faculty members wouldn't dream of doing that, especially if it means they have to get up very early in the morning, as they do in North and South America. But the trend is definitely in the right direction. If we had asked this question 15 minutes ago, not nearly as many people would have responded that they use active learning to that extent.
Before we go into the next material, there's a question that may be on many of your minds. And so let me offer this, and Rich will probably have a response to give you. And as I said, we won't be able to answer every question, but we'll do the best we can, and we'll post responses to others after the webinar. This participant, I think probably from India, says, activity-based learning is a good thought, but the possibility of activity does not happen most of the time. How do we manage activity with the time-bound course?
That's really two questions. How can you find places to include activity frequently in your classes and engineering classes? And then how do you manage to fit in those activities and still cover your syllabus? I'll say something about the first one. Anything you do in an engineering class lends itself to activity. So for example, suppose I'm going through an example of the solution of a technical problem or a derivation of a complex formula. The traditional way of doing it is I just show the students the derivation or the solution, and they look and they nod their heads and they believe they understand it because I'm explaining it clearly. Instead of doing that, if you present some of the solution, and then you get to a rather difficult place in the solution, instead of just showing the students how it goes, you can stop your lecture, tell the students to work in pairs or work individually, tell them you'll give them 1 minute to see how far they can get in filling in the next step. Give them time to do it, a minute or even less, and then stop them, call on a couple of them to report on what they came up with, and then show the correct answer. That 1 minute of struggling that the students do, and you can do that on anything that you're doing in a class, throw it to the students to try it for a brief period of time. Even if they don't get it, when you subsequently present it, that little struggling ahead of time will mean they have a much greater chance of understanding it. Okay, I want to show you a study that somebody conducted. There's been lots of research on active learning, comparing it with traditional lecturing, and an overwhelming body of research shows that it works better. In this particular study, somebody gave a 50-minute lecture, traditional lecture, no activity, and they had a way of monitoring the students' attention. How many students in the class are paying attention to the lecturer as a function of where are we in the lecture? So 0 is the beginning of the lecture, 50 is the end. I'd like you to take just a moment, like 10 seconds, individually, think about what you suspect that curve might look like, and just sketch it on a piece of scrap paper if you have something to write with. Try that, and then I'll show you what the curve actually does look like. All right, here's the curve. The students' attention actually rose for the first 10 minutes or so of the class, probably because when they first come in, they're getting their books arranged and they're talking to their neighbor and so on, gradually turning their attention to the instructor. And then it drops like a rock. Obviously, the value on the ordinate, what percentage was paying attention, depends on how good the lecture is and what the subject is. But in the studies that have been replicated on this, typically you're about 70% of the class paying attention at the beginning of the class, and it drops down to about 20% by the end of the class. Why is that? Because psychologists who study this sort of thing have discovered that human beings have a very limited attention span while they're passive. So as the student is sitting passively listening to the lecture, after about 10 or 15 seconds or 30 seconds, the student's attention goes to something else. They're thinking about their email, or how much longer does this class last, or what's for lunch, or whatever. And then they turn back to the lecturer. And then 15 seconds later, their mind goes off on another one of these mental holidays. And the longer people sit passively, the more frequent those mental breaks are and the longer they last. And so toward the end of that class is gone. what's happening in the class is pretty much a waste of everyone's time, both the teachers and the students. So what's the answer to that? Well, it's simply activity. If you're lecturing and the students are starting to drift off in attention, at some point, give them something to do. Tell them to turn to a neighbor and answer a question you ask, or start a problem solution, or brainstorm a list of something. And now their attention goes way up because people remember much more of what they say and do actively than what they passively receive by seeing and hearing. Now you're lecturing again, now they're dropping off, and then you give them something else to do. Now they're back up, and now you're hovering around 70% attention rather than dropping as low as 20. And obviously, they're going to remember much more of that class than the one in which all that happened was lecturing.
There was a question that one of you wrote, what about, how do you do this in a large class? And just very quickly, remember, you're asking students to clump into pairs or threes, and you just have them do that where they're sitting in the class, and give them a very short time to respond to a particular question or do that next step, and then collect a couple of responses and move on. And so you can do it in a large class as well as a small class.
A study was done in 2014 in which they looked at something like 400 individual research studies of active learning, comparing how much the students learned and how much they remembered as a function versus how much in a typical traditional lecture class they learned. And the evidence that active learning just leads to more learning was so overwhelming that the chair of the National Academies in the United States commission that carried out the study concluded that it's just unethical to teach any other way than active learning. The evidence is so conclusive.
Now, obviously, we can't show you all the evidence here in the webinar, but we have in the handout that you'll have access to after the webinar, lots and lots of resources and places that you can go to find out more about the research. Some of you were asking about the studies, and that's the place you'll be able to find it. Now let's look at a couple of other things about why this activity and connection to the things that are important for students make such a difference. If you think about the criteria for storage, it has some profound implications for teaching, and many of you got this, that the more we make it relevant, the better. So if we have information with an emotional association, and true, most of our engineering content doesn't come loaded up with emotional content with it, but when you have students involved, say in a project where they're working on something that they care about, building the robot, making the concrete canoe, if there's some competition, if there's some opportunity to interact with each other, that has an element of fun, and that can really help students to have a positive emotional association with that material. On the other hand, if there's a lot of fear and anxiety around it, it may block their learning. So the new information, we're getting ready to present this new information with or without emotional association. And if we don't tie it to anything students know already and understand or care about, then it's most likely to be trashed. But if we get that new information and instead we make sure that we talk about how it connects to material they already know, we think about how it connects to their interests and their goals, then we're much more likely to see that information get into long-term memory. But the final caveat is, even if we do that, if we activate that prior knowledge and work with their interests and goals, and it just doesn't make any sense, we don't present it in a way that's clear, then that information is likely to not be remembered and learned. So the important implication is to make that new information relevant. Now, we want to think about especially the first week of class. That may be the most important time for students figuring out that, yeah, I want to learn this stuff. This stuff is important to me, and I'm going to spend the time. So what we'd like you to do now is, again, to give us some of your ideas, or to discuss with a colleague you may be viewing with, something you might do in the first week of class to facilitate this storage of course content in your students' long-term memory. You can make your responses in the chat box, and we will see what ideas you come up with, and then we'll share a few of our own. Someone said, link the course content to prior courses they've taken in their program and how it will be used in their future career.
Very important.
Exactly. Real-time application of the content. Relate the course to their employability. They care a lot about getting a job after their education ends, and so at the university. So another excellent idea. Someone said, pose an interesting real-world problem that involves the content and ask students to think of ways that this course can be used to solve that real-world interesting problem. Another person said, try to connect with a case study or a failure experience. Students really love, the bridge falling down, the building collapsing. And so connecting to some of those kinds of experiences can be great.
This is brilliant. This is a very sophisticated audience.
Someone said, begin with, why are you here? And why am I here? I think that's excellent. Having students really think about what we're doing with each other. And again, I'm going to stop reading these, but these will be available to you after the webinar.
A number of, just one more thing, a number of the comments on here have asked, where can I get more information about the things you're talking about active learning and about connecting with prior material? As we've said several times, you're going to get a handout which contains basically a lot of the information that we're presenting here and references where you can get more information. And I also like to mention that in 2016, Rebecca and I wrote a book called Teaching and Learning STEM, a Practical Guide, published by Josie Bass. And our goal here is not to sell our books, but it is important to let you know that a lot of detailed information about everything we're talking about here, we've put in that book. Okay, now let us address the question of how we can connect our course content to our students' interests, goals, and prior knowledge, which will make it more likely that it'll be stored in long-term memory. And we'll just offer a couple of quick suggestions. One thing I've done in my courses for years is on the first day, their first assignment is to write a one-page autobiography that includes the things they're interested in and their goals and what they like to do and so on. I collect those. It makes fascinating reading what they come up with, but it also gives me good clues about things that I can link my course content to, if it's at all possible, that will connect with at least some of their interests and goals, making it likely that they'll store the information. Another one that I've used many times is to give a test on the prerequisites to a course. I tell the students on day one, your first test in this course is going to be a week from today. It will cover only the prerequisites for the course that you need to know, that you're supposed to know when you come in here. Here's a study guide outlining the important points that you'll be tested on. And then I give them the test the next week. They take it. Most of them do fine. They did whatever they needed to do to get the information back in their heads. And now I don't have to spend 3 weeks of the course reteaching material that they're supposed to know. Very effective technique.
Many of you in the list, and let me just say that your list of ideas is incredible, and we will definitely be sharing those so that you can access them. I've never seen such a good list of ideas, but one that many of you mentioned is getting students to think about application of the course content, perhaps brainstorming and connect that to their goals and interests. It's one thing for us to say, here's how you're going to use this content, and you need it for your job. It's another for them to realize it. So perhaps we overview the course and they understand what the topics will be that will be included. Then a first assignment might be to have them go out and find industries that might make use of this material, or to look in the popular literature and the online news and information resources to see if they can find places where it shows up. in the real world.
They will surprise you by how much they come up with, even though they're just taking the course for the first time. Collectively, they'll generate a very impressive list.
And that's those industry practices, real life practices. Another thing you can think about is doing a demonstration. This is a picture from Walter Lewin at MIT Physics. He does lots of demos in his class and has the classroom set up for it. This one is about conservation of momentum, and so he's quite the showman, and he's got the heavy ball, and he stands there and he gets ready to release it, to swing out and swing back, and he says, "I believe in the laws of physics, and if those laws are broken, this will be my last lecture." So he has a lot of fun with it. But using those demonstrations are very powerful. They let students see what we're trying to teach them. Now, many of us don't teach classes that lend themselves to demonstrations, or we can't set up our classroom with pulleys and swinging balls. But we can think about videos and things of that nature that will give our students a chance to see what our content is all about. And that's a powerful thing to do early in the class.
Okay, here's another implication. There's the student. And here is the way many of our students study for examinations. Very common method. And basically it consists of rereading things. They go back and look over the text that covers the material they're going to be tested on. They look over their lecture notes and maybe look at highlights or highlight things they think might show up on the test. They look back at old problem solutions for old homework assignments that were graded, solutions to old tests that they get a hold of one way or another. Read it over and convince themselves that, okay, I understand that, that makes sense. And then if anything shows up on the exams, they can be helpless because just looking at something doesn't really lead to understanding. It gives them what the psychologists call illusions of competence. They think they understand, but they really don't. And now let's remember this aspect of the cognitive model and the idea of retrieval. When students learn something for the first time, something new, they learn it for the first time, retrieval can be extremely difficult. And you're not retrieving it if you just look at it, reread it in a text or an old problem solution. You're not recovering it from your long-term memory, right? You're not getting spaced retrieval practice. And so what the brain research says is that rereading is an extremely poor, ineffective technique, and it can lead to a lot of failure. So what's a better way? The better way is to give yourself spaced retrieval practice. If you have a lot of content that you're being tested on, make flashcards and test yourself on it, or work with a study partner and quiz each other on it to try to recover it from memory. Instead of looking at old problem solutions, try to reproduce them by memory without looking back at the solution. If you get stuck on something, then you can look it up and then put it aside for a while so that it's not fresh in your memory, and then go back and try to reproduce it again. And when you can solve that problem yourself without looking back at an old solution, and that doesn't mean solving the entire problem with all of the arithmetic and algebra and detailed, straightforward calculations, that takes too long. But just outlining the solution and setting up the equations from memory means you understand it, and when it comes up on the test, you'll probably do well.
So what Rich has been talking about is that really important implication for students. There's also an implication, a couple of implications for us as teachers. The first is to think about using interleaving, and that's just a fancy term for talking about bringing content and problem types back in different contexts in assignments and quizzes. So if we present methods for solving certain kinds of problems in the first couple of weeks of class, and we never bring it back until the exam, students haven't had much chance to retrieve how to do that. And so the suggestion is to bring that content back keep recycling, pulling in, showing how this problem solution methodology can be used with a slightly different problem so that students are getting more and more retrieval practice as they go. And then the second suggestion is to tell students how not to study, what they call going over something, which is really just rereading it, and how to study, that self-quizzing from memory. And if we can do that for our students, it will make a tremendous difference in how much they recall.
All right, and yet another implication. Again, there's the student, information coming in through the student senses into the sensory register. The controller decides, is this important? Usually it's not, and it's discarded. But the important information that the controller decides, I need to take a longer look at this to see if it's worth storing in long-term memory, that goes into working memory. Working memory has two pathways that information can go through. One is called the visuospatial sketchpad, and that's where most of the processing of visual images comes in, videos and pictures and diagrams and flowcharts and so on. The phonological loop is the other pathway, and that's where most of the verbal information comes from. Words, both written words and spoken words, and sounds. So the information goes through one or another pathway, and it gets to the executive controller in the brain. What the executive controller does with each chunk of information that comes through one path or another is go out searching in long-term memory to see if it can find anything related to the chunk that just came in, connected to it, with emotional association, with relevance, with comprehensibility. And then if it finds material, it brings it back to be processed in working memory. If it doesn't find any information, it comes back and reports that. Based on that, it makes the decision. If it finds the information is relevant and potentially important, it stores it in long-term memory. If it doesn't, it trashes it. An important point is that information can be processed in both of those two channels at the same time. So you can be working on a chunk of visual information and simultaneously working on a chunk of verbal information. And that's going to have implications for teaching. What are they? One is that we should not just provide verbal information in lectures, just talking for long periods of time, or showing PowerPoint slides that contain only bullet point lists. That's only verbal information, which means you're not using one half of your working memory.
One person asked a question about why is this emphasis on visual content? And one of the reasons is that when they've looked at preferences that people have, there are we human beings are overwhelmingly visual learners. We really respond best and hold on to best that visual information. At least 2/3 to 3/4 of us are. So that's why we really press that as a very important issue.
So the message is make presentations both visual and verbal. Don't do only one or only the other. Get both halves of working memory working on getting information that you're teaching into long-term memory. And it also says don't present conflicting information in the same channel. If I show a slide with bullet point lists, that's verbal information. And while I'm showing the list on the screen, I'm also talking about what's on the screen. That's also verbal information, and it's two different things happening at once. They'll interfere with each other and cut down on the chances that whatever you're trying to convey will be stored in long-term memory. Another implication, or a related implication, is this. Remember how I started presenting the model? This is a bullet point list. And I gave you a little bit of it just to give you a flavor of this presentation. And then I stopped and I switched over to that. The first one is totally verbal, and I would be saying things about it while I'm showing it. Nothing much would be learned from it. Whereas it's both visual and verbal simultaneously, with the second diagram, the chances that you're going to remember that cognitive model at the end of this webinar are much, much greater than if I had only done the one on the left.
Now, some of you have asked the question about what do we do with slow learners, with students who are just maybe not as well prepared or just take a little longer to get the material that we're trying to teach them.
And the answer to that is active learning. If you're presenting information nonstop for 50 minutes, nobody's going to get all that much out of it because that's not how humans work. But the slow learners are trying to process one piece of information, and while they're trying to understand it, you've presented 4 or 5 more pieces of information. They don't have a chance. If you use active learning, you present some information and then you provide opportunities for the students to reflect on the information and to do something with it, working individually or with others. The slow learners, if you want to call them that, are going to get far more out of that class session than they would if it was just nonstop presentation.
And one other person said, I'm worried that, students need to understand rather than just remember things. And you're exactly right. And in that opportunity that you give students to work a problem, to talk about the implications in an active learning experience, you are giving them a chance to really apply what you're teaching them, maybe to analyze. It all depends on what kinds of questions you ask them to think about when they do these activities. And you can be as high level as you want to be in your expectations. It's not just memory, it's using that material effectively.
And remember, we're not saying active learning is going to be all you do in the class. They're still doing homework assignments, right? They're still going home and trying to solve the different problems themselves, which requires that understanding. But if they just spend 2 minutes struggling with a difficult part of a problem in class and getting immediate feedback, which is what you do in active learning, now when they get to something similar, the same conceptual point on the homework, instead of struggling for 3.5 hours on something that they didn't understand, that brief period of struggle in class when you did that activity can cut way down on how much struggling they're going to have to do in the homework, which is still going to be when most of the real understanding happens.
One of the common questions we get is about how you use these sorts of approaches in an online environment. I can see how I put my students to work in an individual face-to-face class, but what do I do when they're not sitting in front of me? And then some of you have talked about the flipped class approach, where a lot of the content delivery happens outside of the class itself, and in class there are activities. These lead us to the last part of what we want to share with you this morning, which is thinking about how we use these approaches in an online environment. So what we want to do is launch our final poll, which asks you, what is the maximum amount of online content delivery in a course that you teach? So we can kind of get a feel for how much you may be teaching in an online environment. So if you don't do it at all, you would answer the first one. 1% to 20% would be a kind of web facilitated course with some materials online. 30 to 70% would really be considered a blended or a hybrid course where quite a lot happens outside of the classroom online. And then 80 to 90%, or I guess to 99% or 100% would be the online course. So we'll give you just a moment to complete your responses, and we thank you. Lots of you are responding, and that's great. What we're finding in the United States is the percentage of people who are teaching in an online environment has gone up dramatically in just the past few years. It used to be a very small percentage of faculty involved, and now well over half are teaching online environments.
There's one mistake in this poll that I just noticed. That last entry should be 80 to 100% for teaching an online course.
Yes, we have a few gaps in the answers, but you get the idea. So that will be fine. All right, so a lot of you, the majority of you, are teaching in web facilitated classes. So 1% to 20%, something like that, is delivered in an online environment. But quite a few of you, well over 30%, are teaching in pretty heavy duty online environments. So what does all of this that we've been talking about, what are the implications for that online environment? Well, there are pluses and minuses to the online or hybrid instruction. And what we want to do is just highlight for you first some of the negatives that can happen. If you have online content where students are really just passive observers and they're just looking at mostly verbal information. For instance, many online classes consist completely of captured lectures that students then stream or receive in some way where they're just getting a straight lecture. All the reasons we said a straight lecture without engagement doesn't work live are just the same in an online environment. So if all they're getting is here's the PowerPoint with voiceover, or here's the taped lecture, the video lecture, then that's not going to be a very effective technique. And those of you who use flipped classes, this is very powerful for you as well. If this is what you're asking students to look at outside of class, they're not going to be ready to be actively engaged when they come to your class. On the other hand, if you make that online material very engaging of the students and it's visual and verbal, well, how do you do that? Well, maybe you use video clips, screencasts, a section of a lecture, maybe 6 to 10 minutes of a lecture, followed by maybe an online quiz or some feedback. If you're using lots of photos, diagrams, slides, simulations where they get to play around with the content that you're teaching, online discussion forums, threaded discussion forums where students can respond to each other and help each other to understand the material at a deeper level, then you're going to really see your students getting a lot from that, as just as much or even more than they would get from that strictly traditional approach.
I think all of those are good techniques and important to try to incorporate some of them. To me, the most important one is the last one. If you present information to students, something that you want them to learn in an online environment, such as in a flipped classroom, where they watch the online content and then they come to class and work with it, simply presenting information to them and expecting them to build on it when they come back to class is not going to work. But if you present the information and then you give them a quiz on the information that they've just been exposed to, and they key in answers, and if they get it right, they get a verbal pat on the back, a virtual pat on the back. If they get it wrong, they get corrective feedback and an opportunity to try again. Once a student has gone through that in that active a way, now you're going to see them ready to work with the material when they come back to class.
Okay, at this point, we want to revisit some of the questions, and one that came up in two different ways in the chat just a moment ago, I think is important to think about. The one person said, why are some students self-motivated to learn but others struggle? How can we make every learner self-motivated? Do we have a model for that? Or how can we motivate students who don't really maybe have an interest in engineering, or their parents made them come to engineering? So motivation is a really big and important question.
Okay, and I have one piece of bad news for all of you. If your goal is to make every student self-motivated, you're doomed to disappointment, because a lot of it is not under our control. Some students go into engineering not because they have an interest in engineering or a desire to become engineers. They go into it because they heard engineers make good starting salaries, or their father or somebody said, you will be a mechanical engineer like me, and they don't particularly like it. It bores them or it confuses them. They would be much happier in their lives if they found some other way to make a living. it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to motivate students like that to do well in engineering. Some will do it, many won't. We just try to go with as many as we can, and the techniques that we've talked about in here, connecting new information we're presenting in an engineering class with things they already know about and care about and are familiar with, won't motivate all of them, but it will motivate a lot more of them than would be motivated if we just launch into the new material without attempting to make any connections at all.
Another question someone revisited, and I think we haven't said enough about it, is what do we do about those different levels in class? And as Rich mentioned before, with active learning, with those small activities in small groups, what we're doing there is really letting the students help each other to understand and process. So the stronger students might do a little more of the quote unquote teaching. They may be the one that's sort of tutoring their, explaining to their slower colleagues. And we all know that when you teach someone something, you learn it better yourself. So you're helping them. And the students who may be having trouble understanding are getting a chance to reflect, to think about it, to ask questions. Often our peers can explain things in ways that make more sense to us than the professor can as well.
Somebody mentioned that an individual has one strong trait, either visual learning or verbal learning, and that is correct. But the optimal teaching still makes use of both channels. If you only do one, if you only present information visually, then the strong verbal learners will be taught in a manner that doesn't work as well for them. And if you teach only with verbal, the visual learners won't be able to function. If you do it both ways, present information both visually and verbally, you'll be using both halves of the working memory, and the amount of information that will be learned will be greater for all students than what you would get if you only used one or the other.
Another question we have is, how do we ensure that all the students have viewed the video? If you're using a flipped approach or you're using an online environment, classroom environment, you really want to know if students have completed the material. And so the best technique for that is to embed some assessment so that after they look at the video, they have to answer a few questions about it. And that increases the odds that students will actually view what you want them to view ahead of class. Another thing is that as students begin to realize, if you're using a flipped approach, that you really aren't going to go over that content in class, you're going to have them use it. The first few times, they may not be as prepared, but once they begin to see what you're going to be doing, you can really see that increase.
One of the comments we got offers an extremely powerful technique. The comment was, yesterday I had students reflect on what they learned in a design project by writing a resume entry describing what they did and what skills they developed. That gets at metacognition, where the students think about their own thinking, and that is an extraordinarily powerful way of enhancing learning and making them aware of what works for them and what doesn't work. Brilliant suggestion.
I don't think that we really fully answered the question, and we may not be able to fully answer it here, but of how we cover the syllabus, how we get through our course content and use these kinds of approaches. There are a lot of things to bear in mind. Activities don't have to take up a lot of time. They can be very short and just a few within a class session. But there's some other tools you can use as well. And so in the handout that you're going to have access to after the webinar, we have some resources and links. Rich and I have a blog now that we are writing some of these things. And so we talk about covering the syllabus, and we also talk about dealing with student resistance. And the links to both of those will be in the handout that you'll have access to after class. and I just at this point, I want to say for Rich and I, and he'll say as well, how much we appreciate the incredible participation and having you here has just, we could feel your energy through the chats and the questions, and we really, really appreciate that.
And so if anyone ever asks you, can you do active learning in an online environment? Your answer now should be, yes, we did it. And I'll leave you with one final thought. As you enter a classroom, ask yourself this question. If there were no students in the room, could I do what I am planning to do? If your answer to the question is yes, don't do it. And on that happy note, we will conclude the workshop, and thank you again for the wonderful participation and your great ideas.
Richard and Rebecca, thank you so much. What a fantastic webinar. I know that I learned a lot, and I'd like to send a great thanks from our IFES community and also from our attendees. Again, the attendees, you were so engaged, your meaningful contributions, your excellent questions that you posed in the chat forum really helped us to, I think, enrich the discussion about ways we want to improve STEM and engineering education. You know, Doctors Brent and Felder mentioned their book, Teaching and Learning STEM, A Practical Guide. If you haven't had a chance to read that yet, I really think that it's a fantastic opportunity to, again, have a deeper look at a lot of the topics that they started to discuss. They also mentioned that we will be providing a handout at the end of this webinar that contains many of the references as well as other helpful information. There is a recording of this particular webinar that will be made available on our ifes.net website as well as our YouTube channel. And if you're interested in any of our past IFES webinars, we've done them on things like diversity and pedagogy for the global engineer. You'll be able to access those past webinars as well. In the future, we are looking to have some webinars including topics such as industry connections and entrepreneurship. So we hope that you'll join us for those. Be looking in your email for a survey, a very brief survey that's going to come to you about this webinar. And when you finish the survey, there is going to be a special article attached to it from Richard and Rebecca. And so we're hoping that you provide us again with your great insights as you have throughout this webinar in the chat and poll function. And then you'll also have, again, an additional resource. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really look forward to continuing this global dialogue on engineering education. And again, a very special thanks to Doctors Brent and Felder. Have a great day.